The rain was still lashing the windshield when Ronan Faulkner realized the pickup truck tilted into the shoulder of Route 7 had been dead for a long while. He was driving home to Litchfield after a meeting down at the port, his hands stiff from 2 hours on the wheel, and at that time of night the road belonged to no one. The truck sat nose down in the ditch, the driver's door hanging open, the cab light still burning faint, which meant it had been sitting there long enough to nearly drain the battery. Ronan slowed, narrowed his eyes. No one inside. Then his headlights swept the bend ahead, and he saw the shape lying in the wet grass. At first he took it for a bag of trash someone had thrown from a window, but a few dozen yards closer, his heart turned over in a way he hadn't expected. It was a woman. She lay on her side, her face turned toward the ground, her hair plastered to her neck by the rain, as though she had walked to the last step her body could give her, and only then gone down. Ronan pulled onto the shoulder, stepped out into the downpour, knelt beside her, and pressed 2 fingers to her throat. There was a pulse. She was alive, but unconscious, and the state she was in said everything without her having to speak a word. Her feet swollen and raw inside shoes that had split open, her lips cracked dry, and along her left forearm, a set of bruises that had not come from a fall. He stood and looked down the road in both directions. Empty. He could call an ambulance, wait 15 minutes, and hand the whole thing over to somebody else, and for a man like him, that was always the smarter choice. But it was near midnight. The rain showed no sign of letting up, and this woman needed somewhere dry, needed water, needed someone to look at her the way you look at a human being. He didn't know who she was, where she'd come from, or what had put her out on this road. He only knew he wasn't going to leave a woman lying unconscious in the rain and drive on. He bent down and lifted her. And the whole way home, Ronan Faulkner had no idea that in the glove box of the broken-down truck he'd just left behind, there was an envelope that had sat yellowing for 28 years, and on it was his name. If this story reached you in some way, leave a like so we know you stayed with us to the very last minute. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. And if you know someone who needs to hear this one tonight, share it with them. Bern Kettering opened the door before Ronan had a chance to knock, as though he had been standing behind it for a long time, and the first thing he did wasn't ask a question, but step back and make way. He looked at the woman in his employer's arms for exactly 1 second, then turned away and switched on the hallway light. Ronan walked straight through the great living room, past the staircase, and into the room at the back of the house, the room Marin had once called the guest room, though not a single guest had slept there in 3 years. He laid her down on the bed with care, and only when he released her did he realize he had carried her all the way from the car into the house without shifting her weight from one arm to the other even once. Rainwater dripped from his coat onto the hardwood floor, leaving a long trail behind him. Bern brought in towels, placed them over the back of a chair, then stopped in the doorway. "I'll call Dr. Ferris," he said. "No, she has a fever, sir." "I know." Ronan didn't turn around. "Any doctor who walks into this house tonight will write my name on some piece of paper. Then that paper will end up somewhere I can't control." Bern was silent for a moment, then gave a single nod. He didn't ask anything else, because that was how he had worked for 40 years. First for Ronan's father, then for Ronan himself. And one of the reasons he was still alive was that he knew which questions mustn't be asked. He went to fetch warm water, a basin, cotton, bandages, and a bottle of rubbing alcohol from the medicine cabinet in the kitchen, carried everything into the room, then stepped back. Ronan pulled the wooden chair from the corner closer to the foot of the bed, sat down, and began removing the shoes from her feet. The toes had split open, and the leather inside had turned pale from being soaked for far too long. When he peeled off her sock, he had to stop. He had seen many things in his life, but he wasn't accustomed to this, wasn't accustomed to making his hands gentler instead of faster. Her heels had blistered, then split, then blistered again over the same wounds, the edges of the skin dark red, and around her left ankle, the flesh was swollen and far hotter than anywhere else. He brought the back of his hand close and felt the heat radiating from it before he even touched her. He wasn't a doctor, but he understood enough to know one thing. This wasn't new. It hadn't come from tonight, and it hadn't come from yesterday. This woman had been walking on feet like these for days, and she had kept walking long after her body had told her to stop. Ronan dipped the cotton into the warm water and began to clean her wounds, slowly, working down from the ankle, pouring out the dirty water and replacing it 3 times. At one point, she shifted and gave a faint moan in her fevered sleep, her fingers curling around the edge of the blanket, and he stopped and waited until her hand loosened, before continuing. He wrapped her feet with the gauze Byrne had brought him. It wasn't neat, and it wasn't done properly, but it was clean. When he finished, he carried the basin outside, washed his hands at the kitchen sink longer than necessary, then lit the stove and warmed the soup left over from dinner. He ladled some into a bowl, placed it on a tray beside a glass of water, carried it into the room, and set it on the small table beside the bed, though he knew perfectly well she wouldn't wake to eat it that night. He put it there because it was the only thing left for him to do. Then he sat down in the wooden chair in the corner. No one but the cleaning staff had entered this room in 3 years. The glass vase Marin had once filled with flowers still stood on the windowsill, empty now, and Ronan realized he hadn't looked at it once in all that time. He sat with his back straight, both hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the bed, and he didn't sleep. From time to time, he rose and pressed the back of his hand against her forehead, then returned to the chair. Outside, the rain slowly softened into a fine mist that fell steadily over the stone roof. At around 3 o'clock in the morning, she said something in her sleep. 2 or 3 words, none of them clear, and Ronan leaned forward to listen. He couldn't make them out, but there was something in her voice that kept him sitting perfectly still long after the sound had faded. Something he could only describe to himself as the voice of a person arguing with someone who wasn't there. Byrne returned shortly before 4 o'clock with a cup of coffee, placed it on the windowsill without a word, then remained in the doorway for a while. He looked at the man he had watched over since the age of 8. The man whose name the entire coastline spoke with a particular weight when they said Faulkner, now sitting in a wooden chair in the corner of a quiet room, keeping watch over the sleep of a complete stranger whose name he didn't even know. Byrne had lived in this house long enough to know what the last 3 years had done to his employer. A thought came to him, so clear it nearly became words in his mouth. But Byrne Kettering had lived to this age because he knew when to speak, and he turned away, stepped out, and closed the door very softly behind him. She slept through the entire day, and it was nearly 10 o'clock that night when Ronan heard a sound from the room at the back of the house, the faint sound of someone trying to sit up without letting anyone know. He walked over, stopped in the doorway, and didn't step inside. She had managed to sit upright with her back against the headboard, and the first thing she did wasn't look at him. She looked past his shoulder into the hallway, then at the window, then at the second door in the corner of the room that led somewhere else, all within the space of 3 seconds, the sweeping glance of someone counting how many ways there were out of a room. Ronan had seen that look on men's faces in other rooms. He had never seen it on the face of a woman who had only just awakened. "You're in Litchfield," he said in an ordinary voice, without taking another step. "I'm Ronan Faulkner. You collapsed beside Route 7 the night before last. Your car broke down about 5.5 miles from here." She didn't answer. She looked at him, measuring him, and he let her measure. Then she pulled the blanket away from her feet and looked down at the bandages, and the first thing she said in that house wasn't her name, wasn't thank you, wasn't a question about where she was or who had taken off her shoes. It was, "How long has it been?" 2 nights. "Was there pus?" Ronan remained still for a moment. "Yes. Around the left ankle. That's where it was." She gave a single nod, not to him but to herself, like someone who had just confirmed something she had already calculated and took no satisfaction in being right. Byrne appeared behind Ronan carrying a cup of tea, and she turned to him immediately, as though she had already decided which of the 2 men would be the one sent out to buy things. "Cephalexin, 500 milligrams, 4 times a day for 7 days. If the pharmacy won't sell it without a prescription, ask whether they have an antibacterial ointment containing bacitracin. Buy that, along with a box of sterile gauze and a roll of bandage about 1¼ inches wide. The pharmacy on Bantam Road stays open all night, or at least it did 3 years ago." Byrne didn't move. He looked at Ronan. Ronan looked at her. It had been a very long time since anyone in this house had given an order to anyone except him. And the strange thing was that none of the 3 of them seemed to find what had just happened strange at all. "Go," Ronan said. Byrne went. She lowered herself back against the pillow, and only then did Ronan notice the faint trembling in her hand, the trembling she had managed to hold back the entire time she was speaking. "Are you a doctor?" "No." She said nothing more, and he asked nothing more. "There's hot soup in the kitchen," he said, then turned and walked away. 10 minutes later, she appeared in the kitchen doorway. She moved 1 step at a time, one hand braced against the wall, and she had put her own sweater back on after it had been washed and dried, which meant she had gotten out of bed, found where someone had placed it, And done all of that by herself in 10 minutes on feet like those. Ronan didn't rise to help her. He had realized within the first 3 minutes that helping her would be the worst thing he could do. He pushed the bowl of soup toward the chair across from him, and she sat down. She ate slowly with both hands wrapped around the bowl, and when she had finished half of it, she stopped for a long while, her eyes fixed on the tabletop, the kind of pause made by someone waiting for something inside her chest to settle. Then she began eating again. Neither of them spoke the entire time. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, and the only sound left was water dripping from the stone roof onto the front steps. When the bowl was empty, she set the spoon down very gently, as though afraid the sound might damage something. "Sloane," she said. "What?" "My name. Sloane Merrick. Ronan, you already heard mine." She looked at him, and something passed briefly across her face that he couldn't read. It wasn't fear, but something standing behind fear. Something harder than fear. "I'll leave in the morning," she said. "All right." She blinked. Her hand, resting on the edge of the table, went still for half a second. Clearly, that wasn't an answer she had prepared herself to deal with. "You don't want to know what happened?" she asked. Ronan stood, carried the bowl to the sink, and turned on the water. "When you want to tell me, you'll tell me," he said with his back to her. "Now go back to bed. Your feet need rest, and the medicine won't begin working until morning." She remained seated for another moment. He didn't turn around or urge her to move. He simply stood there washing one bowl far longer than one bowl required. Then he heard the chair slide back, and the slow sound of her footsteps moving down the hallway. One step, then a silence, then another step. At the kitchen door, she stopped and whispered a thank you so softly that he almost didn't hear it. The kind of thank you offered by someone repaying a debt, rather than someone feeling gratitude. Then she left. Ronan turned off the water, stood motionless in the kitchen for a while, and realized that throughout their entire conversation, the woman hadn't asked him a single question about who he was. Ronan was awake before 6 o'clock, as he was every morning, and when he passed through the back hallway, he saw that the bedroom door was still closed. He didn't knock, didn't stop, and didn't press his ear to the door. He went down to the kitchen, made coffee, and the only thing he did differently from every other morning was that he didn't turn on the radio. By 7 o'clock, he had left the house. He had 3 meetings in Bridgeport and a telephone call he had to take before noon, and throughout that entire morning, between conversations about shipping containers and work shifts and an overdue payment someone was trying to explain his way around, he didn't think about the room at the back of his house more than 3 or 4 times, a fact he didn't admit even to himself. He arrived back in Litchfield at around 1 o'clock in the afternoon and found her sitting on the stone front steps. She had made it all the way out there on her own feet. Beside her sat Byrne, holding a pair of pliers and trying to open the lid of a can of motor oil with his right hand, which was wrapped in a bandage that had already turned gray around the edges. Ronan switched off the engine and remained in the car for a moment, watching through the windshield. She was saying something to Byrne, and Byrne was shaking his head, the headshake of a 58-year-old man who wasn't accustomed to being told what to do with his own body. Then she held out her hand, not asking, simply extending it and waiting, and after a long moment, Byrne placed his hand in hers. By the time Ronan walked over, she had already removed the old bandage. "You wrapped it in the wrong direction," she said without looking up. "The bandage should run from the fingertips toward the wrist, not the other way around. When you wrap it like this, blood has more trouble returning to the heart than flowing down into the hand. In 3 days, your fingertips will turn purple, and you'll think it's an infection, but it isn't. It's pooled blood." Byrne looked down at his hand. "It's numb anyway," he said. "Yes, because of that." She cleaned the cut again, dried it, then rewrapped it with the new roll of bandage Byrne had bought the night before. And she did it quickly and neatly, without a single wasted motion, without asking anyone's permission. 3 firm turns to secure it, then a diagonal wrap, then the edge folded and tucked into place, finished in less than a minute. When she released his hand, the bandage lay smooth and even, as though it had been applied by a machine. Ronan stood several steps away, and no one had noticed when he arrived. "You know how to do this," he said. She looked up. "I know a few things." And that was all she said. The next 3 days passed in a way Ronan would later be unable to explain to anyone, including himself. There was no conversation in which he told her she could stay. There was no moment when she asked permission. It simply happened. The way things happen when 2 people share the same roof long enough, slowly and without warning, the way rainwater sinks into the earth while no one watches it disappear. On the first day, he came home close to 8 o'clock in the evening and found the kitchen filled with the smell of hot food. A pot of stew sat on the table, made with meat, potatoes, and carrots, simple and unremarkable, but cooked by someone who understood that it needed time and that there was no way to shorten the process. He ate 2 bowls. He said nothing, and neither did she. On the second day, he opened the medicine cabinet in the downstairs bathroom and found it half empty. On the counter sat a paper bag filled with old blister packs and medicine bottles, and beside it was a sheet of paper listing the expiration date of every item in small, even handwriting. Some of the bottles had expired 4 years earlier, which meant they had been there since before Marin died. Ronan stood in the bathroom for a long time holding the paper bag, then carried it out to the trash and said nothing about it. On the third day, he came home earlier than usual and couldn't find her anywhere inside the house. He went around to the back and found her kneeling in the small fenced garden at the far end of the yard. The garden where Marin had once grown herbs and medicinal plants, and where no one had stepped in 3 years except the groundskeeper passing beside it with the mower. Weeds had swallowed nearly all of it. She was pulling them out one clump at a time, both hands covered in dirt to the wrists, and she had already cleared about 1/3 of the garden. Ronan stopped at the gate. "I didn't ask you to do this." "I know," she said without stopping. "It isn't necessary." "I know that too." She raised her head, and there was a calmness in her face that didn't belong to the woman he had picked up beside the road 4 nights earlier. "But if I stay, I want my presence to be useful for something. I don't like owing people. You don't owe anything. Not to you. I owe it to myself." Ronan didn't answer. He stood there for another moment, then turned and went back into the house. And throughout that afternoon, while he attended to the things that had to be done, he kept thinking about what she had said, because it was the kind of sentence people spoke only after spending years explaining why they deserved a place in the world. Late that afternoon, while the 2 men were changing the rear tire on the old pickup in the garage, Byrne tightened the final lug nut and spoke without looking up. "She knows how to work." Ronan nodded. "She isn't from the city." Silence settled between them. Byrne stood, brushing his hands against the legs of his trousers. "I'm not asking anything," he said. "I know. I'm only watching." "I know that too." On the 5th day, at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Ronan was standing on the front steps examining the hinge on the garage gate when he saw dust rising at the bend near the end of the road leading to the house. Apart from his car and Byrne's, only 2 or 3 vehicles traveled that road in an average month. And the way this one moved, neither fast nor slow, steady as though it were approaching an address already known, told him that the driver wasn't lost. It was a black Lincoln, polished, clean, the kind of car that had been washed that morning. It stopped directly outside the gate, exactly where a person with proper manners would stop, and the man who stepped out was somewhere past 40, dressed in a gray suit that hadn't gathered a single wrinkle after 2 hours on the road. He closed the car door very softly. He didn't open the gate. He simply stood outside with both hands folded in front of his stomach and waited. Ronan set the screwdriver down on the step and walked toward him slowly, without moving even slightly faster than his usual pace. "Good afternoon," the man said. "I apologize for arriving without notice. My name is Garrett Nyholm. I represent a family in Massachusetts. Who are you looking for?" "The owner of the house. That's me." Nyholm nodded as though another detail on a long list had just been confirmed. "Then I'll be brief. We're looking for a woman traveling alone, around 28 years old, with reddish-brown hair. She left home about a week ago and may have passed through this area 4 or 5 days ago. She may have been driving an old pickup truck. We're concerned about her." "Why are you looking for her?" "A family matter." "Which family?" Nyholm smiled, a practiced smile of careful politeness. "The Wexford family. You may have heard the name. They have considerable interests along the southern coast of Massachusetts." He paused for half a moment, then continued. "She belongs to the Wexford family." The word fell between the 2 men and remained there. Nyholm heard it the instant it left his mouth. Ronan saw that recognition on his face, in a blink that lasted slightly longer than it should have. The smallest expression of a man realizing he had placed the wrong word in a sentence he had spoken 100 times before, without ever making a mistake. In Ronan's line of work, a misplaced word like that was worth more than an entire interrogation. He said nothing about it. He simply stored it away. I haven't seen anyone, he said. Nihom looked at him. This time, the look lasted longer than an ordinary glance. The look of a man searching through his memory and finding something he hadn't wanted to find. Ronan knew exactly what that look meant because he had seen it on many faces over many years. The moment when a surname was finally joined to a face. Nihom stood motionless for about 3 seconds, and during those 3 seconds, something was decided behind his eyes. Then he spoke again in precisely the same polite voice he had used at the beginning, without changing a single note. Of course. Thank you for your time. You came a long way. Not very far. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket, took out a business card, and placed it on top of the stone gatepost instead of handing it directly to Ronan, a gesture respectful enough to remain courteous and distant enough to keep space between them. In case you remember anything, the family is very eager to find her. I won't remember anything. Yes, Nihom said. I understand. He turned back toward the car, and before opening the door, he tapped the hood twice with the flat of his hand. A small, precise gesture, the kind a man made when he wanted a conversation to end on his terms rather than someone else's. Then the Lincoln turned around and drove away without haste. Ronan remained where he was until all the dust had settled at the bend. Byrne had come out of the garage at some point, and now stood in the doorway with both arms hanging at his sides, watching the car for longer than necessary. The two men didn't say a word to each other. Ronan picked up the business card from the gatepost, read it, then slipped it into his coat pocket. He went inside. In the kitchen, Sloane was standing pressed into the corner beside the window frame, in the one place where she could see the gate without being seen herself, and she stood there like someone who had calculated that position in advance, perhaps from the very first day she had entered the kitchen. She didn't move when he came in. Her face had gone deathly pale. All color had drained from her lips, and one hand gripped the edge of the counter so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She looked at him and said nothing. Ronan didn't ask. He didn't say a single word. He walked to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. Then he pushed the chair opposite him outward with the toe of his shoe, a small motion without the slightest urgency, and remained there looking directly at her. There was no anger in his gaze. There was only a certainty placed between them without the need for words, the kind of certainty that meant the time had come, and they both knew it. Sloane remained in the corner of the kitchen for a long while. Then she released the edge of the counter, crossed the room with steps that were still uneven, and sat down in the chair opposite him. She opened her mouth to speak, but before the first sound could leave her lips, Ronan reached into the inside pocket of his coat and placed something on the table between them. It was an envelope. The paper had yellowed with the age of something kept too long in a closed place. The upper edge was worn, and one corner had been folded and smoothed flat again many times by different fingers over the years. 2 handwritten lines appeared on the front in a man's handwriting. The blue ink faded with time. Ronan said nothing. He simply pushed it toward her with 2 fingers. That morning, Byrne had arranged for a tow truck to bring the pickup back to the garage, and Ronan had gone out to look for the registration papers, because an undocumented vehicle sitting on his property was something he didn't want. He opened the glove compartment and found very little inside. A hardbound notebook, 2 pens, a box of fuses, and the registration documents clipped inside a plastic cover. At the very bottom, lying flat against the base as though it had been deliberately placed there rather than fallen there, was this envelope. He had read the writing on it 3 times before he understood what he was looking at. It contained 2 things. The first was a name, R. Faulkner. The second was a sentence written in smaller letters, slanting slightly downward at the end, as though the writer had hesitated halfway through, if things ever got that bad. Beneath it was a telephone number with a Rhode Island area code, written in the old 7-digit style people hadn't used in a very long time. Sloane looked down at the envelope and didn't reach out to touch it. There was no sound in the kitchen except the hum of the refrigerator. She sat that way for a long time, both hands resting in her lap beneath the table, and Ronan allowed the silence to last for as long as she needed it to. At last, she spoke, and her voice was rougher than it had been before. I called that number 4 times. Ronan didn't answer. The first time was the evening after the funeral. The operator said the number didn't exist. I thought I had dialed it wrong, so I called again. Then I thought it might be an old area code, so I tried 2 other versions. She stopped. None of them existed either. She continued without looking at him, her eyes still fixed on the envelope. She had taken it down to the workshop and asked the only old mechanic who still remained there, a man who had worked for her father for more than 30 years, and now came in only in the mornings to sweep because he didn't know where else to go. He took the envelope, read it, then handed it back to her very quickly, as though it were hot. He didn't explain anything. He said only one sentence, and she had remembered it word for word throughout the weeks that followed. "Don't go looking for that name." After he said it, he turned away and went back to work, she said. I asked him 3 more times. He didn't say another word. Ronan gave the smallest nod. She kept searching. She said she had spent 2 afternoons in the city library looking up the surname in newspaper archives, and what she read made her close the computer and stand outside in the parking lot for a long time. Then she went back inside and continued searching. What she needed wasn't in the newspaper articles. It was in Connecticut's public business registration records, in the list of companies that were still active. And there she found a small transportation company bearing the Faulkner name, with its headquarters listed as a post office box in Torrington. The post office box led nowhere, but in the company's property tax declaration, under the section listing real estate, there was one line giving the address of a house in Litchfield. "That was the last thing I managed to dig up," she said. "I had nothing else." Ronan picked up the envelope. He turned it over. It had never been sealed, and the edge of the flap was still intact, which meant whatever had once been inside had been removed, or there had never been anything inside at all. He held it for a very long time, longer than anyone needed to study a piece of paper. And while he did, he thought about the fact that this envelope had been lying in the glove compartment of a pickup truck in New Bedford for 28 years, 124 miles from where he lived, bearing his name, and he had never known it existed. Sloane lifted her eyes to him, and some color had returned to her face, but what remained in her eyes didn't resemble the look of someone who had just been rescued. It resembled the look of someone waiting to hear a sentence. "I didn't collapse near your gate by coincidence," she said. "I drove 124 miles to get here. The truck broke down 5.5 miles from your gate, and I walked the rest because I had no other choice." She drew a breath. "Do you want me to leave now, or wait until morning?" Ronan placed the envelope back on the table, neatly, with the writing facing upward. He didn't answer that question. He looked at her and asked something entirely different, in the same ordinary voice he used when asking what time a ship would reach the harbor. "How many days do you have left?" Sloane went still. For a moment, she didn't understand. Then she did, and that understanding crossed her face like something collapsing inside her. 34, she said. Ronan stood, set the kettle on the stove, then sat down again. That was all he did to tell her he would remain there for as long as it took. Sloane began to speak, and she told the story in the manner of someone who had rehearsed it inside her head so many times that there was nowhere left for emotion to take hold. Merrick Shipyard stood on a stretch of waterfront in New Bedford. Her great-grandfather had opened it, her grandfather had expanded it, and her father had kept it running. 3 generations. They didn't build large ships, only wooden boats, fishing boats, and small sailboats, the kinds of things fewer and fewer people still needed. But the shipyard possessed one thing that was now worth more than everything it had ever produced: nearly 660 feet of uninterrupted waterfront, sitting directly in the middle of the shoreline. The Wexford family had been acquiring from both ends. They bought 4 properties on the left and 3 on the right within 2 years, she said. Everyone sold. My father's place was the only one left in the middle. The first person who came with an offer was a polite broker, who proposed a figure 1/3 above market value. Her father said no. The second time, they doubled it. He still said no, and he didn't say it in the manner of a man bargaining for a higher price. He said it the way a 68-year-old man spoke about the place where he had been born in the house directly above it. After the second offer, they stopped coming. Instead, things began to go wrong. The insurance company canceled the shipyard's liability policy, claiming it was reassessing risks within the industry, and no other company would take them. Without insurance, the yard couldn't accept customer boats for repair. The supplier that had sold them white oak for 28 years suddenly reported that it was out of stock, then reported the same thing again, then stopped answering the telephone. City inspectors arrived 3 times in 1 month, each time from a different department, and each time they found something different. One thing at a time looked like bad luck, she said, put together. It was a noose being pulled tighter. Her father spoke less and less. Then one morning in March, he couldn't get out of bed. At the time, Sloane had been working night shifts in the emergency department of a Providence hospital for 7 years. She took leave. Then, when her leave ran out, she requested unpaid time off. And when that ran out, she traded shifts with other people, driving more than an hour to New Bedford every afternoon, and more than an hour back again before her shift began. She did that for 4 months. "I knew exactly what I was doing to myself," she said. "I was an emergency nurse. I knew precisely how sleep-deprived a person had to become before mistakes began. I knew, and I did it anyway." The mistake happened one night in July. A 74-year-old man was admitted with an irregular heartbeat, and she signed off on a dose of medication several times greater than what he required. The nurse who took over after her caught it in less than an hour. The man was treated in time, remained under observation for 2 more days, then walked out of the hospital on his own feet. "He lived," she said, and she spoke those words with a strange firmness, as though that were the only part of the entire story she had managed to preserve intact. "He lived. But I still signed that signature, and there was no way for it not to be mine." The state nursing board opened a review. She lost her license. Ronan spoke for the first time, interrupting her. "Who reported it?" Sloane looked down at the table. The kettle began to whistle, and neither of them rose to turn it off. "My husband," she said. "He was a resident physician at the same hospital. He was the first person who knew. He filed the report with the board before anyone had the chance to ask whether he knew anything, because if they found out later, and found out he had known, his name would be in it too." She paused for exactly 1 beat. 3 months later, he sent divorce papers through his attorney's office. "I received them by certified mail." Then she said 1 sentence, and it was the last thing she said about that man for the rest of the story. "The man I married signed his name on that paper." Ronan stood and turned off the stove. He said nothing, and somehow, that silence was what allowed her to continue. Her father died on the 4th of September. At the funeral, while people were still standing outside in the churchyard, 2 men in dark coats approached her. They offered no condolences. One of them handed her an envelope and said that Elias Merrick's debt to the Wexford family would come due 60 days from that day, and that the family expected her to make the necessary arrangements. Then they left. "I stood there, holding that envelope while they were still filling the grave," she said. She searched through everything. For 3 nights, she opened every drawer, every tin box, and every file folder in the wooden cabinet in her father's room. And she read every sheet of paper inside, including electric bills from 15 years earlier. There was nothing. Not 1 line mentioned the Wexford family. Not 1 document bore her father's signature on anything resembling a loan. But the other side had paperwork, notarized seals, and a case number. She took a copy to the notary office in the city, and they told her the documents were valid. She went to City Hall, where they directed her to another office, then another one after that. She went to the police station and sat for 2 hours to make a statement, and no one ever called her back. She hired an attorney in Fall River. He accepted the case, took her retainer, then called 2 days later and said he couldn't continue. She asked why. He said he couldn't tell her why. "That was when I finally understood," Sloane said, raising her eyes and looking directly at Ronan for the first time since she had begun. "They had reached every place I could go before I did. They arrived at 9 o'clock the next morning, and this time, no one waited outside the gate. 3 cars, 1 in front and 2 following behind, stopped side by side across the entrance, in the manner people used only when they wanted those inside the house to see that there were 3 of them. Ronan was in the kitchen, and he heard tires moving over gravel before he saw anything. He set down his coffee cup, said exactly 2 words to Sloane. "Stay here," then walked outside. The man who stepped from the first car was 41 or 42, tall, dressed in an expensive wool coat, and he walked from the car to the gate with the stride of someone who had never once in his life been required to wait for another person to open a door for him. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to, because Ronan knew who he was before he opened his mouth. Byrne appeared in the doorway of the shed on the left side of the yard. No one had called him. No one had warned him. He simply stood there with his arms at his sides, and the fact that he was standing in precisely that place, at precisely that moment, was already a statement the men in those 3 cars understood. "You're Faulkner." "Yes." Preston Wexford. He stopped on the other side of the iron gate. "I won't waste your time. My man came here the day before yesterday, and you told him you hadn't seen anyone." "I know you have." Ronan didn't answer. The blue pickup with Massachusetts plates. It was towed off Route 7, and it's sitting in your garage about 65 feet from where I'm standing. I don't need you to confirm anything." Ronan looked at him, and he thought, not for the first time in his life, that men who believed bluntness was a form of strength were usually men who had never paid a price for something they had said. "She has unfinished business with my family," Preston continued. "Financial matters, paperwork. None of it concerns you, and I don't see any reason it should." "Then don't make it concern me." There was a brief pause. Preston smiled, and the smile didn't reach his eyes. "You know," he said, his voice shifting into a slower rhythm, the rhythm of a man about to deliver something he had prepared during the drive. "I've heard you do business at the port in Providence. Transportation, warehousing, that sort of thing. I've also heard the Longshoremen's Union contract down there comes up for renewal in January." He allowed the sentence to settle between them. "My family has friends on the city council. It would be unfortunate if that renewal ran into difficulties over a woman you don't even know." Ronan said nothing for about 4 seconds. He stood there looking at Preston Wexford, and there was nothing on his face. No anger, no surprise, not even the contempt another man would almost certainly have allowed to show. Byrne, standing 20 paces away, knew what that silence meant, and he shifted his weight slightly onto his left leg. "You don't know who I am," Ronan said. "Don't I?" Preston blinked. "I know your name." "That isn't what I asked," and in that moment, something very small appeared in Preston Wexford's eyes. It wasn't fear. It was the discomfort of a man who had just realized there was a piece of information he should have possessed before driving 2 hours to this place, and he didn't have it. The Wexfords dealt in real estate. They had been wealthy for 15 years, and they believed the Massachusetts waterfront was the entire map. He turned his head toward the second car, perhaps looking for Nyholm, but Nyholm wasn't there. One of the 2 men standing beside the third car mistook that glance for an order. He stepped forward and pushed against the iron gate. It opened only about 8 inches. Byrne had already crossed those 20 paces and placed one hand on the horizontal bar, neither quickly nor urgently, and he didn't push back. He simply rested his hand there and stood still. He wasn't as tall as the other man, and he was nearly 28 years older. But there was something in the way a 58-year-old man walked forward and stopped in exactly that place without once looking around for support, and the other man understood it, and his hand left the gate. For 1 second, everyone in that yard knew exactly what would happen if anyone took another half step. No one did. "Get back in the car," Preston said. He was speaking to the other man, but his eyes remained on Ronan. Then he turned away, and before getting into the car, he added over his shoulder, "You're choosing the wrong side at a very expensive cost, Mr. Faulkner." "Maybe," Ronan said, "but it's my side." The 3 cars backed out, turned around, and drove away. Ronan remained where he was, until the sound of the final engine disappeared completely around the bend. Then he took out his telephone and dialed a number he knew by heart. The man on the other end answered after 2 rings. "Emmett, boss. There's a family named Wexford in New Bedford. Real estate, waterfront property, 3 or 4 generations of something, but the money is new. The father's name is Augustin, 2 sons, one named Preston, the other Hollis. I want to know who they really are, who they owe, and who owes them." There was a very brief silence on the other end, so brief that Ronan wouldn't have noticed it if he hadn't spent 15 years listening to people over the telephone. "Wexford," Emmett Rourke said. "All right, I'll ask around. This week?" "Yes, boss." That evening, Ronan went out to sit on the porch as he had done for the past 3 years, the wooden chair drawn close to the stone railing, and about half an hour later Sloane came out after him. She didn't ask whether she could sit. She pulled over the second chair, the one that had always rested against the wall unused, set it down at a respectful distance from him, and sat. Beyond them lay darkness and the sound of crickets, and farther still were the low hills that could be seen during the day but now appeared only as a black outline, darker than the sky. They sat that way in silence for a long time. Then Ronan spoke without turning his head. 3 cars weren't there to collect a debt. Sloane didn't answer. People don't take 11 men on a 2-hour drive to collect money from a woman who has no money, he continued. They send letters. They send attorneys. If they want to frighten someone, 2 men are more than enough. He paused. What I saw this morning wasn't a creditor. What I saw was a man coming to take back something he believed belonged to him. The silence lasted so long that he thought she might not speak at all. From inside the house came the sound of Byrne closing a kitchen cabinet. And then that sound faded too. He came to the shipyard for the first time at the end of September, Sloane said. Her voice was perfectly ordinary, and it was that very ordinariness that made Ronan sit even more still. 3 weeks after the funeral, he said he had come to discuss things properly, between two families, without attorneys. He sat in my father's office, in my father's chair, and told me he understood that I was in a difficult position. She tilted her head slightly. He was right. I was in a difficult position. That was what made everything he said afterward effective. Preston Wexford had presented it as a solution. There would be no need for a lawsuit. If she agreed to marry him, the debt would disappear, not be repaid, but disappear, because people within the same family didn't collect debts from one another. The shipyard would still bear the Merrick name on its sign. Her father would be remembered. They would preserve the name on the waterfront, and perhaps even give it to the new marina. And she would never again have to worry about money, insurance, inspectors, or anything else for the rest of her life. He said all of it in the voice of a man helping someone. She said, "That is the part I remember most clearly." He didn't think he was doing anything wrong. He thought he was being generous. She paused for one beat. He called it a choice. But when someone drives you into a corner and leaves exactly one door open, it isn't a choice. It is the name they give it so you'll walk through willingly. Ronan said nothing. I said no. He didn't believe you. No. He thought I needed time. He came back a second time in the middle of October. Then a third. She looked down at the hands resting in her lap. The third time, I said no in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. I told him I wouldn't marry him even if it were the only way, and I said it inside the shipyard, with 2 workers standing about 40 feet away. She stopped. He wasn't accustomed to hearing that answer where other people could hear it. She said nothing more. She simply pulled her left forearm out of the sleeve of her sweater, turned it beneath the weak yellow light spilling from the kitchen window, and held it there for several seconds so he could see. The bruises had faded to a pale yellow now, almost gone, leaving only the faint shadow of their former shape. Then she pulled the sleeve down again. She didn't say a single word about how it had happened, and Ronan didn't ask. He didn't ask because there were questions whose very asking forced a person to live through something one more time, and he had learned long ago that what he wanted to know wasn't always something he had the right to ask. He remained still, staring into the darkness ahead for a long time. There was anger inside him, but it didn't come the way people imagined anger came. It didn't rise. It settled, sinking lower, finding a place and lying there, heavy and silent, the kind of anger he had spent years learning to contain, because thoughtless anger always found someone to hurt, and usually it wasn't the person who deserved to be hurt. He had seen that happen to other men. He had seen it happen to himself once, when he was much younger, and he still remembered the cost. "He won't stop," Sloane said. "No. Even if I lose in court and lose the shipyard, he still won't stop, because for him, it was never only about the shipyard." "I know," Ronan said. "I understood that this morning." He raised a hand and rubbed his face once, then lowered it to the arm of the chair. "You have 33 days. After that, the debt comes due, and they will file with the court, and if you have nothing in your hands, the court will read their paper and believe it. That means within the next 33 days, you need to find something better than that paper. I know, and you will have to return to New Bedford at least once to get it." Sloane turned to look at him. "You aren't going back there alone," Ronan said. It wasn't a question, and they both knew it. She remained silent for a long time. Then she said softly, "I know." The next morning, Ronan drove to Hartford alone, telling no one except Byrne, and he parked 2 blocks from the house he needed to visit, then walked the rest of the way. The house stood in an old neighborhood filled with 2-story wooden homes, one corner of its front porch sagging, and 3 stacks of cardboard file boxes were piled beneath a sheet of plastic on the porch. Ronan knocked. It took quite a while before he heard footsteps. The man who opened the door was 71 years old, small, white-haired, wearing thick glasses and a hand-knitted sweater with a hole at one elbow, and he stood there looking at Ronan through the narrow opening for exactly 5 seconds before speaking. "Well," Halvard Prosser said, "you've come to ask me for help, after 11 years. "Yes." The old man didn't smile. He didn't close the door either. "You do know I spent 11 years of my life trying to put you on trial." "I know. I have a copy of your files." There was a silence. Then Hal exhaled sharply through his nose, a sound almost like the laugh of a man too old to be surprised by anything anymore, and opened the door wider. "Come in. Don't sit in the chair on the right. One of the back legs is broken." Inside, every flat surface was covered with paper. The dining table was no longer used for dining. An old, yellowed map of the New England ports hung on the wall, and beneath it stood 3 steel filing cabinets that Ronan suspected weren't empty. Hal cleared a stack of folders from the chair on the left, set them on the floor, then sat opposite him. "Talk. Before that, I want to say something." Ronan sat down. "You spent 11 years losing to me because you were honest. Had you not been honest, you would have caught me by the 3rd year." Hal looked at him. "That is a remarkably arrogant thing to say. That is why I'm sitting here. I need exactly that. Nothing else." The old man said nothing. He simply reached for a notebook and a pencil, opened to a blank page, and gave one nod. Ronan told him everything. He began at the beginning and left nothing out, including the details that reflected badly on him: the woman beside the road, the 20-year-old envelope, the shipyard in New Bedford, the stretch of waterfront, the cancelled insurance, the halted lumber deliveries, the inspectors arriving 3 times in 1 month, the old man falling ill and dying at the beginning of September, the 2 men at the funeral, and the envelope handed over while the grave was still being filled. 60 days. Not one document belonging to Elias Merrick mentioned the Wexford family, while the other side had paperwork, a notarized seal, and a case number. The attorney who accepted the case then abandoned it 2 days later. The 3 cars outside Ronan's gate the previous morning. Hal listened to all of it, without interrupting once. He only wrote in small, even letters, occasionally making a sound deep in his throat, the sound of someone fitting a piece into its proper place. When Ronan finished, the old man remained silent for quite some time. "Wexford," he said at last. "Augustin Wexford. I knew that name from when I was still in Boston. Back then, he was buying seaside vacation homes and reselling them 6 months later. He was vicious even then, but he was smart enough to preserve appearances." He removed his glasses and stared into the distance. The sons inherited the viciousness without inheriting the patience. That happens often. He put his glasses back on. "Now let's talk about the document, because the document is what will decide this, not those cars outside your gate," he explained. In his 30 years of experience, fabricated debt instruments in that region almost always fell into one of 2 categories. The first was a forged signature, an agreement created entirely from nothing, and that was the easiest kind to produce, but also the easiest to destroy, because modern handwriting analysis could tear it apart within 2 weeks, and the person who created it would go to prison. The second kind was far more sophisticated. They found a genuine transaction, something very small that could be proven, a $2,000 loan from 15 years earlier, a verbal agreement over a piece of machinery, a receipt the dead man had actually signed. Then they built a story around that grain of truth and inflated it into an enormous sum. "The second kind is harder to break," Hal said, "because one part of it is true, and that true part persuades the judge to believe everything else." "Which kind do they have?" "I don't know yet. I need to see the original." He tapped the tip of his pencil against the table twice. "More specifically, I need to see the back of it. The seal, the form number, the date entered in the registration section. People are always careful with the front and careless with the back, because the front is what they imagine a court will read." "How long?" 1 week. I still have a few places I can ask without making anyone nervous." He tore a piece of paper from the notebook, wrote a name on it, and pushed it across the table. "But this is what you need before you need me. Ruth Ann Delacourt. Her office is in Boston. Land law and maritime law. Nearly 28 years. And most important of all, she doesn't owe anyone in this region a thing. No relatives, no favors, no clubs. You take Miss Merrick to meet her. Not you. Your name mustn't appear anywhere in the records of this case. You understand why?" "I understand." "Good." Ronan picked up the paper, folded it, and slipped it into his pocket. He stood. Hal stood as well, more slowly, bracing one hand against the table. He removed his glasses and began cleaning them with the hem of his sweater, a gesture Ronan remembered him making at the hearing in 2013, when he had risen from the witness chair after 4 hours without obtaining what he needed. "Ronan," he said, his eyes still on the glasses, "if the Wexfords discover you're helping her, they already sent the message. Yesterday." The old man's hand stopped. Then he gave a quiet laugh, very brief, almost soundless. "You've never known fear," he said. "That has always been your problem." He returned to Litchfield late that afternoon and handed her the slip of paper bearing the attorney's name. Sloane read it, folded it, and sat down at the kitchen table with the paper still in her hand. But she didn't ask anything about Ruth Ann Delacourt. She asked something else. "May I ask you a question you might not like?" "Ask. I've read enough to guess who you are." "That isn't what I'm asking." She placed the paper on the table. "What I don't understand is why you drove yourself 2 hours to Hartford. Why you went out to the gate yourself to speak with their men. Why you were the one who cleaned the wounds on my feet that first night instead of someone else." She looked at him. "How many people does a man like you have working under him? 30? 50? Why didn't you send someone to do these things?" Ronan didn't answer immediately. He pulled out a chair, sat across from her, and for a while he only looked down at his hands resting on the table. "Because I'm not allowed to," he said. She waited. "My wife died 3 years ago. Her name was Marin." It was the first time he had spoken that name in the house since Sloane arrived, and he said it in an ordinary voice, the ordinary voice of a man who had passed through the stage when he couldn't say it at all. "She died in a parking lot in Providence. I was told it was something between 2 other groups, settling matters with each other, and she was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time." He paused for half a beat. "After that, the federal government opened an investigation. Not to find out who did it. They opened it because they thought it was a chance to turn over everything connected to me." He explained it briefly, in language someone outside his world could understand. The investigation had never been closed. It had remained open for 3 years, and that meant every outgoing call from the telephone of anyone who worked for him could be recorded. Every trip they made could be documented, and every name appearing beside Faulkner's name in any file would be pulled out and examined. "Suppose I handled this the usual way," he said. "I send 2 men down to New Bedford. They speak to Preston Wexford. Maybe it works immediately. Maybe he backs off for a month." He shook his head once. "Then what happens to you? You go to court with your civil case, and the other side stands up and says their client was threatened by men belonging to an organization under investigation by a federal grand jury, and that this woman is living in the home of the man who runs that organization." He looked at her. "From that moment on, no one cares whether their document is real or forged. You won't be Elias Merrick's daughter trying to recover her father's shipyard anymore. You'll be Faulkner's woman, and you'll lose, even if you were right from beginning to end." Sloane sat without moving. She looked down at the paper with the attorney's name, then raised her eyes again. "So it can only be you." "It can only be me," he said. "I can drive myself. I can stand outside the gate myself. I can do everything without anyone else, without a telephone call, without another name attached to mine. They can't record that because there is nothing to record." He tapped one fingertip lightly against the table once. "My strongest position is also the one I'm not allowed to touch. Do you understand now?" "I understand." She was silent for a while. Then she asked the question she had carried inside herself since her second night in that house. "Why are you doing this?" Ronan didn't answer immediately. He stood, walked to the sink, turned on the faucet, then shut it off again without washing anything. The motion of a man who needed somewhere to place his hands while he thought. "My father owned an auto repair shop in Pawtucket," he said with his back to her. 4 bays, 2 lifts. He did everything himself, and never hired anyone except one apprentice. He stood there for a moment. "When I was 12, some men came. They didn't break anything. They only came in, sat in the office, and spoke with him several times over 3 months. Then one evening he came home, sat at the dinner table, and told my mother he had signed." He turned around. "I was sitting right there. I didn't understand what he had signed. I only understood that he wouldn't look at my mother when he said it." He returned to the table and sat down. He never recovered. It wasn't the money. There is always some way to deal with money. It was what happened inside him. He still went to work afterward, still ate dinner, still spoke to people. But something in him had been taken away, and it never came back. He lived another 19 years that way. Sloane said nothing. "I have spent my entire life standing on the other side of that table," Ronan said. "I know exactly how it is done because I know the men who do it, and for many years I was one of them. But there is one thing I have never touched, and that is the land of someone who has nothing left to lose." He looked at her. "I won't stand by and watch it happen again. Sloane remained silent for a very long time after he finished speaking. Then she stood, went to her room, and when she returned, she was carrying an old leather wallet, the kind made for a man, and she placed it on the table without opening it immediately. "There is something I haven't told you," she said, "not because I was hiding it, because I wasn't sure it was true." Ronan waited. "My father told me this story exactly twice in my life. The first time was when I was just a little girl, around 5 or 6 years old, and asked him what the envelope in the glove compartment was. The second was 10 days before he died, when he could barely speak anymore." She placed both hands on the wallet. "In 1998, a man came to the shipyard close to midnight. My father was 39 then. The man arrived on foot, alone, and he didn't say what kind of trouble he was in. He only asked whether there was somewhere he could sleep for a few days." Ronan didn't move. "My father let him stay in the materials storage room behind the shipyard. 3 nights. He brought him food, brought him water, and didn't ask a single question. On the morning of the 4th day, the man left." She paused. "Before he went, he left money on the table. My father chased him all the way to the gate and gave it back. He told the man that if he accepted it, then it would become something else, and he didn't want it to become something else." Ronan felt something begin to move very slowly inside his chest. "The man's name was Faulkner," Sloane said. "My father never told me what kind of trouble he was in. I don't think he knew either." Outside, darkness had fallen completely. Byrne had gone to bed long ago, and the only light left in the kitchen came from the lamp hanging above the table. "A few months later," she continued, "after everything had settled down, the man came back. This time it was during the day, and he brought a child with him." Ronan raised his head. "My father said he came to thank him, and that he wanted the boy to see the shipyard. He didn't explain why. My father didn't ask." She opened the wallet, took a small photograph from the innermost compartment, its edges worn round, its colors faded into the reddish-brown cast of film left too long with age, and pushed it across the table. Ronan picked it up. The photograph showed the inside of a wooden boatyard. An unfinished boat lay upside down in the center of the frame, and light poured through a large doorway on the left. Standing near the boat was a tall man, with his sleeves rolled to the elbows, looking toward the camera with the slightly awkward expression of someone unaccustomed to being photographed. And in the right corner, almost half cut off by the edge of the frame, was a little boy bent over a wooden table, both hands resting on something, his head tilted to one side because he was too absorbed in what he was examining to notice anything else. Ronan said nothing for a very long time. He remembered. He remembered the instant he saw that large doorway, even before he noticed the boy. He remembered the smell. That was the first thing to return. Not the image, but the scent of fresh wood shavings mixed with pine resin and seawater drifting in from outside. A smell he had recognized every time he passed a woodworking shop during the past 28 years, without ever understanding why it made him turn his head. He remembered a very tall man bending down until they were eye to eye and handing him a wood plane, a tool heavier than he had expected, and the man had placed one hand over his and shown him how to keep his wrist straight so the blade would move smoothly instead of catching in the grain. He remembered getting it wrong 3 times. He remembered that the man hadn't shown impatience even once. He remembered sitting at that table all afternoon, shaving a piece of oak until it was smooth, and he remembered carrying it home in the car, holding it in his hand the entire way while his father drove beside him without speaking. That 8-year-old boy hadn't known why his father had brought him there. He had only known that it was a beautiful afternoon, and that someone had given him a piece of wood. "I still have it," Ronan said. He spoke almost to himself, his voice low, his eyes still fixed on the photograph. "It's in the top drawer of the desk upstairs. It followed me through 4 different homes. I never threw it away, and I never knew why I couldn't." Sloane said nothing. She allowed him to hold the photograph for as long as he needed. At last, he placed it neatly on the table, with the image facing upward, and pushed it back toward her. She didn't pick it up immediately. "So you didn't remember my father's name?" she said. "No, I didn't even remember where it was. I only remembered the shipyard." "Then, do you owe me something?" She didn't ask because she wanted to collect a debt. She asked because she needed to know where she stood, and Ronan understood that. He straightened in his chair, and when he answered, he looked directly into her eyes. "No," he said, "I don't owe you anything. You haven't done anything for me." He placed one finger against the edge of the photograph and pushed it slightly closer to her. But I owe your father. He sheltered my father for 3 nights and returned his money at the gate. And you are what he left behind. Hal called on Tuesday morning, said exactly 4 words. I have something here. Then hung up. They left that afternoon. Ronan parked 3 blocks from the house as he had before. And this time, he led Sloane through the alley behind it and in through the kitchen door. Because over the past 22 days, too many people had come to know her face in places she had never set foot. Hal opened the door, studied her for exactly 3 seconds with the eyes of a man who had spent 30 years deciding whether someone was telling the truth, then nodded and stepped back. He had cleared the dining table. That was the first thing Ronan noticed. On the bare wooden surface lay only a thin file and a magnifying glass with a handle. Sit down, he said. Both of you. He opened the file and removed an enlarged photocopy printed in sharp detail. I couldn't get the original. The original is in the Bristol County Registry records, and I no longer have the authority to touch it. But I have a certified copy, and for what I need, a copy is enough. He pushed the paper toward Sloane. You read it first, she read. Ronan watched her face as she did, and he saw her jaw tighten at the 3rd line, where her father's signature appeared, or the thing pretending to be her father's signature. There are 3 things, Hal said. The first is something anyone can see if they bother to look. He pointed to the lower right corner. The registration date, September 25th. Sloane looked up. My father died on the 4th. Correct. This document was taken to be notarized 3 weeks after the man who supposedly signed it was dead. He tapped 1 fingernail against the table. That doesn't automatically make it fraudulent. People register documents late, sometimes years late, but it is the first question any judge will ask, and it forces the other side to explain themselves. People don't like being forced to explain. He turned to another page. The second thing is visible only if you know what you're looking at. It was an enlarged photograph of the upper edge of the document, where a sequence of tiny letters and numbers had been printed. This is the form code. Every state has its own system, and Massachusetts changes its forms every few years. This code, the sequence beginning with 2 letters, followed by 4 numbers, belongs to a form introduced at the beginning of 2022. He looked up over the rims of his glasses. But the document claims the loan agreement was created in June of 2020. A brief silence settled over the kitchen. So this paper claims to record something that happened 4 years ago, Sloane said slowly. But it was printed on a form that didn't exist until 2 years ago. Correct. It is fraudulent. She didn't say it with surprise. She said it in the voice of someone hearing test results confirm what she had known in her bones for weeks, and the relief in that voice was mixed with something else, something heavier. That is the kind of mistake they can't recover from, Hal said. There is no argument that can explain it away. They can't claim someone remembered the date incorrectly. Either the form existed at that time, or it didn't. He closed the file. With this, along with the registration date, Miss Delacourt will have something she can stand up and argue in court. Sloane released a very long breath. She raised one hand to cover her mouth for a moment, then lowered it. But Hal didn't stand. He remained seated, both hands resting on the closed file, and he said nothing for so long that Ronan turned to look at him. Then there is the third thing, he said. Say it. The old man opened the file again, turned to the final page, and pushed it toward Ronan rather than Sloane. It was an enlarged photograph of the seal, the raised circular impression pressed into the paper, with a name and registration number running around its edge. You can read it, can't you? Ronan read it. He read the name of the office, then the address on the line below, and he said nothing. Warwick, Rhode Island. He had stood inside that office. He knew where the broken coffee machine sat in the corner of the waiting room. He knew the name of the man who sat at the desk farthest inside, and he knew the man's wife's name, and he knew exactly how many kinds of documents that office had stamped for him over the past 15 years, papers that made lawful things which, without that seal, would have been nothing more than empty words. I know this place, he said. I know you do, Hal said. That is why I let her read everything else before I showed this to you. He removed his glasses. The Wexfords didn't create this paper themselves, Ronan. They aren't capable of it. They are real estate people. They know how to buy land and pressure people, but they don't have anyone who can provide this seal. He placed his glasses on the table. They bought it. Through an intermediary, certainly through an intermediary. so no one would have to mention names, and no one would have to know who they were buying it from. He looked directly at Ronan. But the machine that produced it belongs to you. Sloane turned toward Ronan. Ronan didn't look at her. He sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the photograph of the seal, and there was nothing on his face, not because he felt nothing, but because everything had sunk beneath the surface at once, leaving the water above perfectly smooth. You didn't know, Hal said. It wasn't a question. No, I believe you. But you understand that not knowing changes nothing. I understand. They remained another 15 minutes to discuss what should be said to Ruth Ann Delacourt and what mustn't be said. Then the two of them left through the back door, walked through the alley, and Ronan unlocked the car, got in, and closed the door. He didn't put the key into the ignition. He sat there with both hands resting on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the brick wall ahead, and he remained that way for a very long time. Sloane sat beside him and asked nothing. She didn't ask because she had seen his face when the old man spoke that final sentence. And she had worked enough years in an emergency room to know that there were moments when the only decent thing one person could do for another was sit beside them in silence and say nothing at all. From where they were parked, a church bell somewhere rang 5 o'clock. 11 days remained. Throughout the 2-hour drive home, he said nothing, and neither did she. When they reached the house, he didn't go into the kitchen right away. He walked straight to the garage, stood there for about 20 minutes, then finally came inside. Sloane was standing by the sink. Ronan didn't pull out a chair. He stood at the head of the table with both hands resting on the back of one and spoke. I need to say this now, because if I leave it until tomorrow, I'll find a way to make it sound easier to hear, and you don't deserve that version. She set down the dish towel. The office in Warwick is mine, he said. Not in the sense that I own it. In the sense that it has survived for the past 15 years because of me, and whatever passes across the desk of the man who sits inside it passes because I allow it. I know where he eats lunch. I know which school his daughter attends. He paused for one beat. The seal on the paper that took your father's shipyard came from that office. Sloane said nothing. I didn't know, he said. I know you're going to ask, and the answer is no. I didn't know. I had never heard the name Wexford until the day they stopped their cars outside my gate. But I won't stand here and use that as an excuse. His hands tightened around the back of the chair. Because that isn't what matters. What matters is that for 15 years, I built something designed to make papers look real. And I knew perfectly well what it was used for. And I accepted that it would be used for things I would never see. That was the price I agreed to pay a long time ago. I simply always believed I was paying it with my own money. He looked at her. It turns out I paid it with your father's shipyard. He didn't apologize. He didn't say anything beginning with if, didn't say he hadn't meant for it to happen, didn't say he would make amends. He simply stood there and allowed that final sentence to remain between them. Sloane didn't answer. She looked down at the tabletop for a long time. Then she walked past him, took the coat hanging from the hook beside the door, and went outside. The door closed very softly, more softly than if she had slammed it. Ronan didn't follow her. He remained where he was, his hands still resting on the back of the chair, and stood that way for a long time before pulling the chair out and sitting down. Byrne appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing his nightclothes, his hair disheveled. He looked at the closed back door, then at his employer. He didn't ask what had happened. Where do you think she can go, sir? He said. Her truck is sitting in our garage. Then he turned and walked away. Ronan sat at the kitchen table throughout the night. He didn't turn on any light except the lamp hanging above the table. He didn't open the door to look outside, didn't go upstairs, and didn't sleep. At one point, around 3 o'clock in the morning, he rose and walked to the window, and he saw a figure sitting on the stone step at the far end of the garden, beside the low fence surrounding the herb garden, with her back turned toward the house. He stood at the window for about a minute. Then he returned to the table and sat down. He didn't take a coat outside to her. He thought about it and chose not to, because he understood that anything he brought her now would be a way of forcing her to respond, and she had the right to be alone without having to respond to anyone. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the door opened. Sloane came inside, the shoulders of her coat damp with dew, her hair wet, her eyes red and swollen in the way of someone who had cried a long time ago, rather than someone who had only just stopped. She didn't look at him. She hung her coat on the hook, walked to the sink, turned on the water, washed her hands, and dried them. Then she picked up the coffee pot, emptied the old grounds, rinsed it, measured out the coffee, poured in the water, and lit the stove. She did every one of those things in the same order she had followed each morning for the past 20 days, neither faster nor slower. Ronan sat without moving. While she waited for the water to boil, she stood with her back to him, both hands braced against the edge of the counter. "I don't forgive you," she said. He didn't answer. "I don't know whether I can. I don't even know whether that is the right thing to do, because I still haven't found a name for what I would have to forgive." She paused. "I sat out there for 4 hours thinking, and this is the only thing I was able to understand." She turned off the stove. The coffee had boiled. "Since my father became ill, I have met a great many people. The insurance company, the supplier, the inspectors, the attorney in Fall River, the police." She poured coffee into 2 cups. "My former husband." She set down the pot. "Not one of them told me a single honest sentence. Every one of them had a reason. Every one of them had a way of speaking that made what they did sound different from what they had actually done. No one ever stood in front of me and said the thing that would make me think less of them once it was spoken." She turned, took both cups, and walked to the table. "You are the first." She placed 1 cup in front of him, setting it down so gently that it made no sound at all. "I haven't forgiven you," she said, "but I'm staying." Then she pulled out the chair opposite him and sat down, and that was her answer. Ruth Ann Delacourt called back on Friday afternoon and spoke with Sloane for 40 minutes. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, she kept it brief. She agreed to take the case. She said she was accepting it for 2 reasons. The first was the form code. The second was that she had read the Wexford family's marina development file 2 years earlier and had wondered who was still refusing to sell. But she couldn't go into court carrying a photocopy of a document belonging to the other side. She needed proof that Sloane Merrick was the lawful owner of that property, and she needed either the original documents or clear photographs of the originals. The deed showing the date ownership had been transferred from her grandfather to her father, property tax receipts for at least the most recent 5 years, and the state-issued registration records for the shipbuilding facility. "Do you have those documents?" she asked. "Yes," Sloane said. "Where are they?" "In the wooden cabinet in my father's room, the 2nd drawer from the top." There was a silence on the other end of the line. Then Delacourt told her the rest, and she said it in the voice of someone accustomed to delivering bad news to people who desperately needed good news. The Wexford family had filed for an order granting temporary possession of the disputed property, and the court had issued it the previous Wednesday. That meant that while the case remained unresolved, no one was permitted to enter the house or the shipyard, including the person whose name appeared on the deed. They had hired a licensed security company, and 2 guards were working shifts there, one during the day and one at night. "I need to make this clear," she said. "If you cross that threshold, you'll be violating a court order. If they catch you inside, I won't be able to save this case. The other side will stand up and say this woman has no respect for the authority of the court, and no one will want to hear anything I have to say about the form code. You'll lose everything, and you'll lose it for a reason completely different from the reason they intended to take it from you." Sloane asked whether there was any legal way to retrieve the documents. Delacourt said there was. They could file a petition asking the court for permission to enter and remove the records, but the process would take between 3 and 6 weeks. Sloane looked up at the calendar hanging on the kitchen wall. 10 days remained. When the call ended, she placed the telephone on the table and sat without moving for a long time. Ronan stood in the kitchen doorway, and he had been there for nearly the entire call. "I have to go inside and get them," she said. "I know. You understand that if I'm caught in there, I lose immediately." "I understand. That is why you won't be caught." He spent the next 2 days calculating. He didn't write anything down. The old pickup in the garage had been registered in Byrne Kettering's name for 11 years, with Connecticut license plates and nothing distinctive about it. Exactly the kind of vehicle no one turned to look at on Route 6. They would travel in that. Both of their telephones would remain in the kitchen table drawer in Litchfield, switched off, because even a telephone with the power turned off could still tell its story if it traveled with its owner. No calls would be made before, during, or after. No one would know. Not Emmett, not anyone at the port, not the attorney. Not even Miss Delacourt? Sloane asked. "Especially not her," Ronan said. "If she knows beforehand, she'll have to lie to the court. If she doesn't know, then all she receives are photographs from her client, and she has no obligation to ask where her client obtained them." Byrne listened to the entire plan in the garage, still wiping motor oil from a wrench, and he didn't object to a single word. When Ronan finished, he asked only one question. "Do you need someone to stay here and watch the house?" "Yes." "Then I'll stay." He set down the wrench. "You leave Tuesday night and return Wednesday morning. If you haven't called me from a payphone somewhere by 7 o'clock Wednesday morning, I'll do the thing you won't like." "You won't do anything." 7 o'clock in the morning, Byrne said, and he picked up the wrench and returned to his work. On the night before they left, the two of them sat on the porch longer than usual. It was late October now, and the air had begun to carry the dry cold of the season. Every light inside the house had been turned off. They sat in silence for quite some time, and that silence wasn't like the silence of the nights before, because they both knew something would happen the following day, and neither of them wanted to speak about it. So neither of them spoke about anything at all. "Are you afraid?" she asked. Ronan thought for a moment before answering. "Not in the way you mean," he said. "I'm not very afraid of being hurt. I passed that point a long time ago, and honestly, that isn't courage. It is only familiarity." He raised a hand and rubbed the back of his neck. "What I'm afraid of is making the wrong calculation. I've spent 2 days working through everything, and I'm still not certain I've seen every part of it. If I miscalculate somewhere and tomorrow you are the one who has to pay for that mistake, then yes, I'm afraid of that." Sloane said nothing for a while. Then she spoke, and her voice was perfectly ordinary. The ordinary voice of someone speaking about something that had lived inside her for too long to feel heavy anymore. "I'm afraid all the time. Since the day my father died, I've awakened with fear and gone to sleep with it. It is there when I wash my face, when I drive, when I eat. It is like a ringing in the ears that can't be silenced, until sometimes I forget it is there and begin to think it is me." She looked into the darkness ahead. "But here," she said, "for the first time, it becomes quiet for a little while." Ronan didn't answer. He sat beside her without moving, and together they looked into the darkness, and neither of them felt any need to place more words inside it. 4 days remained. They left Litchfield at 9 o'clock on Tuesday night. Both telephones remained in the kitchen table drawer, switched off, and Byrne stood in the garage doorway watching until the taillights disappeared around the bend. The drive took 2.5 hours, most of it along the highway, and Ronan stayed precisely within the speed limit the entire way, not even 1 mile faster, because the worst thing that could happen tonight wasn't being caught inside the house. It was being stopped by a patrol car because of a faulty brake light. Sloane sat in silence for nearly the entire journey. When they entered New Bedford, she began giving directions in very short sentences. "Turn left at the second light. Follow this road to the end, then turn right." She didn't look at a street sign once. They parked among a cluster of low trees about 330 yards from the house, in an empty space where people had once left boat trailers. Then they waited. Ronan turned off the engine and the lights, and the two of them sat in darkness for nearly an hour and a half. At one point, Sloane said quietly that the streetlight on the corner had been broken since she was in high school, and no one had ever repaired it. Then she said nothing more. At 5 minutes before 1 o'clock, Ronan opened the truck door. They walked along the rear fence without using a flashlight. The house stood on a piece of land that sloped gently toward the water, and behind it was the shipyard, a long building with a sheet metal roof, its large door closed, and covered by a white notice that appeared in the darkness as nothing more than a small, pale mark. Sloane went first. She led him around the side, avoiding the gravel yard and walking instead along the narrow strip of grass beside the wall. At the back steps, she stopped, placed her hand on his, then stepped over the second stair without touching it. He followed her. The back door was locked. She reached into her coat pocket and took out a key she had carried with her since the night she fled, the spare key that had hung from a nail in the kitchen since she was a child. The lock made a click that sounded far louder than it truly was. Nothing moved. Inside, it was dark and smelled like a house that had been closed for several weeks. From the hallway, they could see flickering blue light spilling from the front living room and hear the faint voices of a late-night television program. The guard sat in an armchair with his back to the door, his head tilted to one side. Ronan raised 2 fingers. Sloane nodded. She moved first, turning left into the short hallway leading to her father's room. Ronan stopped at the entrance to the hallway and stood at an angle, keeping one eye on the bedroom door and the other on the pool of light in the room beyond. He checked his watch. 1:02 in the morning. Inside the room, Sloane didn't switch on a flashlight. She went directly to the wooden cabinet against the wall, opened it, and reached inside. She didn't feel around blindly. Her hand moved straight to the second drawer, passed over the spines of the folders like someone reading raised letters, stopped, pulled out a file, folded it in half, and placed it inside the cloth bag hanging across her body. Then she opened the drawer below it, then the tin box in the farthest corner. Ronan didn't watch her work. He watched the blue light at the far end of the hallway, and he counted. 14 minutes. He would remember that number for a very long time afterward, because 14 minutes spent standing in a dark hallway without being allowed to make a sound lasted longer than any other 14 minutes of his life. At the 9th minute, the sound of the television changed. Then came the creak of the armchair springs, the scrape of its legs moving backward across the wooden floor, and footsteps. Ronan turned, stretched one arm across the bedroom doorway, and pressed his palm against the wooden door to hold it still. Inside the room, the rustling of paper stopped halfway through a movement. The footsteps passed the end of the hallway without turning into it, and continued toward the kitchen. The kitchen light came on, casting a long strip of yellow across the floor toward Ronan's feet, stopping about 8 inches from the toes of his shoes. Water ran from the faucet. A glass touched the stone counter. The water stopped. During that time, no one inside the house breathed. The kitchen light went out. The footsteps returned, and passed the hallway a second time, more slowly now. Then the armchair sank beneath the guard's weight, and the television volume rose by 1 level. Ronan removed his hand from the door. 3 minutes later, Sloane appeared in the doorway with the cloth bag held tightly against her body. She gave exactly 1 nod. They retraced their path, through the back door, down the steps while avoiding the second stair, along the strip of grass beside the wall, across the dark yard, and through the opening in the fence. Neither of them ran. Ronan had told her beforehand that running was what made people notice you. Only when they reached the trees, and the pickup appeared as a black shape among the branches, did they truly breathe again. Sloane stopped. She didn't open the truck door. She stood there in the darkness, holding the cloth bag against her chest with both arms, her head slightly lowered, her eyes closed. She remained that way for a long time. She didn't cry. Ronan said nothing. He only placed one hand on her shoulder once, briefly, then let it fall, and walked around to open the truck door. They left New Bedford by the coastal road, and drove another 20 minutes before switching on the high beams. By the time they reached the highway, it was nearly 3 o'clock in the morning, and the road was empty. Sloane still held the bag on her lap with both hands resting over it. "When I drove to your house," she said, staring straight ahead, "I didn't have any plan at all." Ronan didn't turn toward her. "I didn't know what you would do. I didn't know whether you would throw me out at the gate, or do something worse. I had nothing to offer in exchange. I had no money. I didn't even have a story that made any sense." Her hands tightened slightly around the bag. "All I had was a name written on an envelope I had sworn to myself I would never use." The truck traveled a long distance before either of them spoke again. "And you still drove there?" Ronan said. "Because I had nothing else left." Sloane sent the photographs to Delacourt at noon the next day, and the attorney replied within 40 minutes with a single line. "This is enough. I'll file it on Friday." She filed it on Friday. The following Monday, the court issued a temporary stay, and the 60-day clock Sloane had been counting down 1 day at a time since that morning in the cemetery suddenly stopped halfway through. It didn't disappear. It simply stood still. But that night was the first night she slept without waking until morning. 4 days later, the black Lincoln returned. This time there was only 1 car, and Garrett Nyholm stepped out alone, with no one else sitting inside. He was still wearing a suit, still stopped in precisely the right place outside the gate. But something in the way he stood had changed since the first time. "I'll be briefer than I was before," he said. "You're pushing this farther than it needs to go for your own sake. Preston is angry. When Preston is angry, things become difficult for the person standing in front of him, and I can't always stop that." "Is that a threat?" "It is a warning, offered with respect." Ronan looked at him for a long time. "Mr. Nyholm," he said, "the form code on your document will collapse the moment someone bothers to examine it. But that isn't what I want to speak with you about." He tilted his head slightly. "What I want to speak about is the seal." Nyholm went still, not for a second in the figurative sense, but for exactly 1 second. A measurable pause. And during it he didn't blink. "You know where that office is," Ronan said. And I think you also know that I know." Nyholm didn't answer. He looked at Ronan for another moment, then turned toward the car. This time he didn't tap the hood. He opened the door, got inside, and drove away in silence. And Ronan stood there, thinking that Garrett Nyholm was the most intelligent man in the entire Wexford organization, and that was precisely why he would be the first man to abandon the ship. But from that day forward, the trail Ronan followed was no longer about the Wexfords. It took him 5 days. He asked no one at the port, called no one, and left no trace that could connect his name to the question he was asking. He went to Warwick twice, sat in his car across the street, and simply watched. He found a retired man in Cranston, who had worked as a clerk for that office for 7 years, and now grew tomatoes in his backyard, and the man spoke with him for 40 minutes beside the fence, without ever realizing who he was speaking to. There was only one name. People called him the intermediary, and during those 7 years, the former clerk had seen his face only 3 times. But he remembered him because he always came on Thursday afternoons and always paid in cash. Ronan followed that description, and it led him to a man in Pawtucket. And the man in Pawtucket, once he understood who was sitting across from him in an empty diner at 10 o'clock in the morning, gave him a name in less than 2 minutes. Emmett Rourke. Ronan remained in that diner for another 20 minutes after the man had left. He didn't order more coffee. He only sat there and allowed everything to arrange itself into place. Emmett had been with him for 12 years. Emmett was the man who had stood beside him at Marin's funeral. The man who had handled everything during that week when Ronan couldn't handle anything. The man who had sat in Ronan's kitchen on the 3rd night after the funeral and told him he had to accept what had happened, that it had been a matter between 2 other groups, that she had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Ronan had believed that for 3 years. He had built the entirety of the last 3 years of his life upon that sentence. And now, sitting in that diner in Pawtucket, he remembered a detail he hadn't thought about once since that day. Marin had kept the books for the legitimate side of his business. During the final 3 months, she had asked him twice about expenses in Warwick that she couldn't reconcile. He had told her to leave them alone. He remembered exactly what he had said. "Just leave them there. I'll ask Emmett." He arrived at the port at 4 o'clock the following morning. Emmett Rourke had always been at Warehouse 4 before the morning shift began, and that hadn't changed in 12 years. Dawn hadn't come yet. There were only the tall floodlights and the sound of water striking the pilings beneath the dock. Byrne came with him and stopped 10 paces away, standing still with both arms hanging at his sides, and he remained that way from beginning to end. Emmett turned and saw Ronan, and Ronan saw on his face the thing he needed to see, in the very first half-second, before the man had time to arrange his expression. Ronan asked 3 questions. He asked them very slowly and very clearly, and he never raised his voice. He asked whose hands the Warwick seal had passed through before it reached the Wexford family. He asked what Marin had questioned him about in April 3 years earlier. He asked whom he had called after she asked. Emmett Rourke didn't answer a single question. At the second, he opened his mouth, then closed it again. At the third, he lowered his eyes to the concrete dock and kept them there. There was no punch. No one raised a hand. There were only 2 men standing opposite each other beneath the floodlights, one asking questions and the other saying nothing, and that silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. Ronan remained there for another moment. "You didn't pull the trigger," he said. "You only picked up the telephone." Then he turned and walked away. Byrne didn't move until Ronan had passed him by 3 steps, and only then did he turn and follow. Neither man looked back even once. Ruth Ann Delacourt spoke plainly to both of them in her Boston office one afternoon in early December. The form code was enough to raise suspicion. But suspicion was something the other side could argue against, and they had enough money to keep arguing for 3 years. The only thing they couldn't argue against was proof that the seal had been sold. Who had sold it, who had bought it, and for how long the arrangement had existed. And the only thing that could prove that was the ledger Marin Faulkner had kept. The ledger recording 15 years of the Faulkner organization's activities, the ledger Ronan knew exactly where to find, and hadn't opened once in 3 years. 3 days later, they sat across from federal prosecutor Corinne Atwater. She promised nothing. She made it very clear that she had no authority to make promises. Full cooperation, complete testimony, the dissolution of every operation at the port, the forfeiture of nearly everything held in his name, and the sentence would be decided by a judge, not by her. "I don't sell mercy, Mr. Faulkner," she said. "I'm only telling you that you'll be heard." On the drive home, Sloane said no. She said it before they had even left the parking lot. and she said it in a voice he had never heard from her before. "I won't trade your entire life for a shipyard. I'll find another way. I've already lived without it for almost a year." Ronan pulled to the side of the road, turned off the engine, and looked at her. "You think I'm making this trade for the shipyard?" he said. She couldn't answer. "My father signed a paper when I was 12 years old, and no one stood beside him," he said. "I spent my entire life searching for a way to make sure I would never be in that position again. And the way I found was to become the man sitting on the other side of the table. It worked. It worked for 28 years. He looked straight ahead. "Then it turned out that Table had taken the shipyard from the only man who ever treated my father with kindness, without taking a single dollar from him. And my wife died, because she discovered it 3 years before I did." He started the engine again. "I'm not making this trade for the shipyard." He signed the following Monday, and he signed without knowing how much he would lose. The ruling came on a February morning. The court declared the debt instrument invalid, ruled that the shipyard and the entire property belonged to the Merrick family, and ordered that any foreclosure proceedings the other side still wished to pursue would have to begin again from the start with valid documents the Wexford family didn't have, and never would. Their lawsuit was dismissed. Preston Wexford was placed under investigation for obtaining a possession order based on evidence the court had declared invalid. Augustin Wexford fell ill at the end of that month, and the marina project was suspended indefinitely, leaving the 3 properties they had purchased lying empty on either side of a stretch of waterfront that would never belong to them. Sloane received the telephone call in the kitchen. When she hung up, she stood with her back to the window and said nothing, her shoulders rising and falling in the way of someone crying without wanting anyone to see. Ronan rose from the table and walked toward her. She turned before he reached her. Byrne entered the kitchen, saw them, and withdrew without making a sound, and that may have been the most tactful gesture that man had ever made in his life. In June, in New Bedford, Merrick Shipyard launched the first boat completed since Elias Merrick's death. The family who had commissioned it stood together on the dock, and the children shouted and clapped when the hull touched the water, competing to hold the length of ribbon still caught around the bow. Laughter carried across the harbor, a sound that stretch of waterfront hadn't heard in a very long time. Ronan stood several steps away. He had lost the port, lost most of what had once carried his name, and was awaiting the day he would stand before a court, with no one able to tell him how that day would end. He kept the stone house in Litchfield, and the old pickup registered in Byrne's name. Halvard Prosser arrived late, walked to the end of the dock with the help of a cane, and stood watching the boat rise and fall on the water. "Elias used to say," he began after a long while, "that land holds on to those who know how to hold on to it." He looked out across the water. I think he was right. Sloane stood beside Ronan. She reached out without looking at him. He took her hand. This story was never about a shipyard, a forged document, or power. It was about the fact that kindness is never truly lost. Sometimes it simply lies still for 28 years inside a glove compartment, waiting for the day it can return to the person worthy of receiving it. 3 nights of shelter that a boat builder gave to a stranger, and a piece of oak a child carried home, traveled through 2 generations to become the very things that saved both families. This story also tells us that a person can live in darkness for a very long time and still retain the right to choose to step into the light, even when the price is nearly everything they possess. And it tells us that sometimes life sends someone through your gate on a rainy night, without warning, without permission, at the moment you least expect them, and also the moment you need them most. If this story left something in your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so that each day we can continue listening together to more meaningful stories. How did Ronan and Sloane's story make you feel? And which part of it stayed with you most deeply? Please leave a few words in the comments below. We truly hope to hear the feelings that come from the deepest place in your heart. We wish you and your family lasting health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in our next video.